We will now begin our third plenary session titled Nationalism or Internationalism. Dr. Lee Jung-min, Senior Fellow from Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, will be moderating this session. Dr. Lee, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you had a good rest. Let me thank Ham Jae-bong for inviting me, I don't know, for the 9th time or 8th time, I forget, to the Asan Plenum, and for Chairman Chung Mong-jun for making this a reality for so many of us here in Korea. This is a very, I think, timely topic, and I think it really encapsulates the current Korean dilemma. And I say this because since the last 3,000 years maybe, until the 1960s, Korea's worldview was trapped by geography and variations of state ideology. And external relations, as you know, were limited to contacts with China and Japan. And you fast forward to 1950 to 2000, what I would call the half-century of internationalist Korea. And yet, nationalism in Korea today has become a tool for a particular type of political legitimacy. They want this to be cleansed from the vices of imperialism and nurtured by the innate virtues of a so-called pure race. And that, I think, resonates more in North Korea than anywhere else. This is why, I would argue, unfettered nationalism, bordering on jingoism, goes against liberal and democratic values, which all of us in this room aspire. Again, expressions of hyper-nationalism are not germane to Korea. We see this in China, Japan, and other places, and including Europe as well. And in order to tackle this really important issue, I think Jae-bong has brought together a first-class group. I know that all of them are known to you and very well known to the audience, but let me just briefly explain why they're here. And beginning with Pascal Boniface, he is arguably one of France's leading intellectuals on security issues. He has been editor of L'Année Stratégique, strategic review, since 1985, and a voice for France's moderation and a critical role. Edwin Feulner, as you know, is the founding president of the Heritage Foundation. And as I was researching his background in a positive way, I found that when he became president of Heritage, there were 9 full-time staff. Is that right?
That's right. That's right.
And over the course of 20, 30 years, he made Heritage into the most consequential think tank in Washington. So no mean feat.
Thank you.
In the middle, without a jacket, is, of course, my very good friend, John Ikenberry. He is, without a doubt, the foremost IR scholar of my generation. And he is currently on leave at Oxford, has written 7 books, penning his 8th, and I'm sure that we will be delighted to hear your views on where these two paradigms lie. We have a very special guest from Israel, Yuli Tamir. She is the recent author of Why Nationalism, published by Princeton University Press. And John had nothing to do with the fact that your book was published at Princeton. And she also served as deputy speaker of the Knesset and was a 2-time member of the Israeli government under the Labor Party. And she was also the founding member of Peace Now. Last but certainly not least, we have Paul Wolfowitz, who is very well known to the audience here and abroad. He is currently a scholar at AEI, president of the World Bank, deputy secretary of defense, ambassador to Indonesia, and former assistant secretary. But more than anything else, he embodies what I would argue is the Confucian literati, extensive experience in government as well as in academia. So welcome to you all. Let me begin by going down the lane, as it were, to give us your introductory remarks, and then I'll make sure that we all have a fun time discussing this really important issue. Pascal, s'il vous plaît.
Thanks. Good morning to everybody. I'm very grateful to Asan to invite me, and very impressed by the quality and intensity of the debate. And so thank you so much, and congratulations. We speak about international community very often, but if international community is frequently mentioned, most of the time we complain about its failure, and not to praise its success. the Syrian war, the Middle East conflict, climate change, international criminality, all these challenges are not coped in a good manner by international community. So most of the time, international community is like the Loch Ness monster. Everybody has heard about, nobody has seen it. World is a global village, but without any city council or mayor and any common view on the way to deal with the most important challenges. Hopes and dreams of the new world order of the post-Cold War era has been dashed, and there is no agreement between big power to manage our problems. So there is a crisis of multilateralism. Of course, when we speak about a Frenchman of crisis of multilateralism, the first name in mind is Donald Trump. Donald Trump, which pulled out US from UNESCO, from Paris Climate Agreement, the way he deals with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and also we break the Iranian nuclear deal. It's not only the problem to break the deal signed by US, by Russia, China, UK, Germany, and France, and USA, but more important is to threaten of sanctions the ones who want to continue to have economic relations with Iran. So it's perceived in most of the country as a denial of sovereignty. But the problem, in fact, in US is not limited to Trump. In France, we remember that the BNP, one of the most important banks, has been fined of $9 billion when Obama was president. And NSA eavesdropping were taking place during Obama administration and not Trump. So there is a problem of unilateralism in USA that Trump pushed forward, but he has not created this kind of policy. But to tell the truth, the problem is not limited to USA. And if multilateralism is in crisis, it's due to other countries, not only USA. In Russia, Putin thinks that the openness is perceived as a weakness by the West and took an assertive position and want to have a revenge on history and want to scrap the 90s to stand firmly again. In China, there is doubt about the word multilateralism. Xi Jinping and Chinese leaders use these terms very frequently, but there is not a clear definition. And for the One Belt, One Road, it's not taken for granted that it's a bilateral agreement or at least a two-way street, but it must be perceived as a one-way street to export more Chinese products and not to open its market to foreign products. And Netanyahu, Erdogan, MBS, Bolsonaro are champions of nationalism and unilateralism. All of them are strong men and alpha male leader, and they are really open to other views. And in my continent, Europe, we are in a deep crisis. In 10 out of 28 countries, the far right is part of a governmental coalition. Europe has been built on democracy, on multilateralism, on peace, and in 10th or a third of the government, the far right, we thought that it has been defeated for good after World War II. The far right is very strong. And if EU has multilateralism and democracy in its DNA, we have even difficulties to find common position among 28 countries. For the time being, the only agreements to proceed to Brexit during the 27, but it's not even sure that we will succeed to have a good solution. And if we were unable to cope in 4 years from now, the refugee crisis, but in one of the most rich continents of 4 150 million of inhabitants, it would have been easy to host 1 million of refugees. We were not able to do it in a good way. But globalization doesn't mean the end of nation state. Nation state is not obsolete. It's still a pivotal actor of international relations. But we could and must combine nation states and multilateralism. And we must make a difference between nationalism and patriotism. It's not the same concept. Multilateralism is not a choice in our global world. It's an obligation. None of the biggest challenge humankind must cope with could be dealt without a collective approach. And I could only mention climate degradation. It's not climate change, it's a degradation. Change could be positive, degradation is not. Collective security to fight against terrorism, to fight poverty, and to struggle against epidemics. No one country, even the most powerful, has the solution. Only together we could find a common approach. And so we must create a new alliance, overcoming the old ones, the alliance of multilateralism. Could be done in United Nations, could be done in a specific way, but on every important file, we must have a collective approach, which is unfortunately not the case for the time being. Thank you.
Thank you. Feulner.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much. I want to cover 3 basic points, if I may, in my opening remarks. First one, I want to respond to some comments from yesterday and this morning from you, Pascal, now, about the Iran deal. Secondly, I want to talk briefly about President Trump and then share some reflections I have from 2 rather extensive recent trips to Europe. First, on the Iran deal. Let's remember when the Iran deal was signed by John Kerry, endorsed by Barack Obama, they did not take it to the United States Senate as a treaty the way they should have under U.S. law and under our Constitution. Instead, they went to the United Nations. Yes, the P5 and the Security Council all unanimously supported it for their own strategic reasons. In my perspective, for the UK and France and their colleagues in the EU in order to expand trade with Iran. China, for its own internal reasons, for supply of oil and petroleum products, and Russia to offset America's presence in the Gulf with our alliance with Saudi Arabia, de facto alliance with Saudi Arabia. And here, I've been reminded by our colleague Paul Wolfowitz that one of Obama's strategic objectives, clearly stated, was that the Gulf ought to be shared between Saudi Arabia and Iran. This was, shall we say, not the view of many, certainly who were affiliated with the early Trump administration, or for that matter, with the Trump administration today. In fact, going back to Obama, as I say, it was never ratified by the U.S. Senate where it should have been, where it would have required a vote of 60 U.S. senators to carry it. Instead, shortly after the UN action, which put it in place, 58 U.S. senators of the 100 agreed that it was a bad deal for the United States. So when Trump expressed certain misgivings about the Iran deal and pulled us out of it, yes, he was acting in U.S. national interest, but he was doing it in a way that he was rejecting a radical solution from his predecessor that in fact had not gone through the proper procedural process in Washington. Talk about what just happened within the last 24 hours in terms of the increased pressure on Iran in terms of reducing or eliminating oil exports. I reminded one of my friends from Europe that in fact, under the sanctions previously announced some time ago by the Trump administration, that in fact there was to be no oil exports from Iran, but that what happened actually now was Trump said he will not reissue the SREs, significant reduction exceptions. In other words, there was this exception put in order to buy some time for alternative suppliers to come along. And that's what he chose not to renew. So, and obviously from reading the press accounts, the decision was made in conjunction with our friends in Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And a reminder also to all of our friends that now the United States is the largest single energy producer in the world, that we have some export capabilities that are perhaps underutilized as well. Enough on Iran. Let me, the obvious reasons for pressure on Iran in terms of being the greatest exporter of terrorism in the world, in terms of what it's doing with its own nuclear capability, in terms of what it's doing in destabilizing the neighborhood of the Middle East, in terms of what it's doing in the Gulf, are perhaps beyond discussion here, but they're all, I think, very realistic. Secondly, a brief comment about President Trump, who does not always get the most favorable hearing at the Asan Plenum. Those of you who were here last year know that I kept my back to the wall after I defended in the keynote the Trump foreign policy. But a point of reference, I commend Trump's June 2017 Warsaw speech. One of the points he made, speaking not only to Poles, but speaking to the world, he said, "Our freedom, our civilization, and our survival depend on bonds of history, culture, and memory." Perhaps almost self-apparent to everyone in this audience, but not apparently self-apparent to all of our allies who view the world, I think, fundamentally different from a Trumpian viewpoint. Let me talk about my recent experiences in Europe, New Europe, Old Europe, and Neutral Europe. I can dispense with Neutral Europe rather quickly, because on several visits recently to Zurich, Bern, Basel, Switzerland's main objective at the moment seems to be a bilateral free trade agreement with the United States, and let their big neighbors go sort things out as they will, a position with which I have a great deal of sympathy. Let me talk now about Old Europe. And Pascal, I throw something out to you right now. When we talk about Old versus New Europe, a phrase I've seen used is religious Romanians and pious Poles versus skeptical Germans and agnostic Frenchmen. When I, as a person who greatly admires and participates in religious activity, have to hear from the president of France that he's going to have an international competition as to what's going to happen to rebuilding of Notre Dame. Notre Dame's not a museum. Notre Dame's a place of worship, and I would frankly much rather hear what the Cardinal Archbishop of Paris says is going to happen to Notre Dame rather than the president of France. There is a very real difference between Old Europe, the Old Europe of Angela Merkel and virtually unlimited immigration, and New Europe, where I've had the opportunity recently to visit Poland on several occasions, to see their differing perspectives. The Old Europe where the New Europe rather, Old Europe, where the German Green Party said 25 years ago, we eliminated East Germany. Now isn't it time we eliminate West Germany? In other words, eliminate sovereignty of the nation state. I don't think that's either a good idea or a welcome idea to most observers, but it is something that gains currency. To my mind, some of the extreme efforts at globalization these days are in effect taking the liberal international order, taking liberalism and putting it on steroids. We don't need to do that. there is a reasonable balance, I think, in between the two, where we can come together and figure out how we can move ahead together in a comprehensive and coherent way in terms of reaffirming our shared commitments to the new international order, to the international liberalism correctly understood, rather than to throwing the baby out with the bathwater, if you will. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. Sean?
Thank you. It's great to be here. It's a real honor to be on this panel and to talk about these issues, which I think we'll have some lively debate. These are not happy times for liberal internationalists. Looking around the world, the U.S.-led 70-year-old open multilateral order is fragile and breaking down in various ways. In every region of the world, you have liberal democracies that are in retreat, that are fragmented, polarized in various ways. And so there's a general dismay about the status of this liberal international order. And it's surprising, not only concerning, but it's surprising. It's surprising in two respects. One is that it was only a few decades ago, 20, 30 years ago, when we were celebrating a very different kind of world, the post-Cold War world, a liberal moment, the globalization of economic and political liberalism, a kind of global or worldwide consensus. It didn't last for long, but it did last for a while, that representative government, that constitutionalism, human rights, open trade, multilateralism were the kind of successful model. There's been a kind of verdict of history that this is the kind of system, both individually and collectively, that the world wanted. So that's surprising that we've come so far from that consensus. Secondly, it's surprising in that the old patrons of the order, Britain and the United States in particular, have seemed to pull back from their leadership position. This is really the story of 2016, Brexit and Donald Trump. It is ironic because these two states, Anglo-American countries, have been unusually important over 200 years in the 19th and 20th century in promoting a certain kind of international order, open rule-based order, with lots of other things. They've not simply been liberal states, they've been other kinds of states, but they've had this imprint. And now it seems like they are saying, wait a minute, we want off. We want to rethink our project. And obviously, President Trump has been tough on the U.S.-led post-war order. He's been tough on all sorts of different aspects of it, on trade, on alliances, on international institutions, on human rights, on immigration, and on, yes, democratic solidarity. And thinking about the world, do you look out into the world and see a group of liberal democracies that require our attention, that are a kind of grouping, a kind of club that we build our foreign policy around? So these are ideals and institutions that have been used over 70 years to define American foreign policy and its global role, and they seem to be less strongly articulated today than ever before. And obviously, this is not everything. President Trump is as much consequence as cause. There are deep revolts against liberal internationalism around the world, background conditions, the power transition regionally but globally as well, led by China, the weakening and polarization of liberal democracies in Western Europe and around the world, breakdown of political compromises, class compromises, political bargains, growth coalitions are all adding additional fragility to that liberal order. So what is the future of internationalism? And so I will just make 3 points in trying to put some ideas out there. First, it seems the first move one needs to make after one makes the observation is that one should take the long view, that internationalism, so too nationalism. But internationalism didn't begin in 1991. It certainly didn't even begin in 1945, that it's had a longer history, really 200 years, internationalism as a kind of phenomenon as it emerged with the rise of liberal democracies more generally. And it has had a series of cycles, of crises, of transformations, golden eras, great catastrophes. Think about the 1945 internationalist project. Think about what was the world that had to be dealt with at that moment. I read with great interest Ira Katznelson's book, Desolation and Enlightenment, which talks about the 1945 generation who saw in front of them really the ruins of an earlier internationalism. Total war, fascism, totalitarianism, the Great Depression, the Holocaust, and the rise of atomic weapons, and yet they rolled up their sleeves and worked away at trying to rebuild the international system. And you see, in doing that, they redefined internationalism. The internationalism of the Versailles period was redefined in the age of FDR, more attention to connecting domestic liberal democracies, the search for security at home, with a working international order, FDR's Four Freedoms, the Atlantic Charter. These were ideas about building into internationalism commitment to economic security and the protection of rights. So that's number one. Number two, there are other forces and projects out there in the world that internationalism has to deal with. It's important to remember that internationalism that was formed into this US-led liberal order took place inside of a larger global order. It was an inside system. It was a system of beginning with Western states, a larger set of alliances that was part of the bipolar system. And so it was a subsystem. It wasn't the global system. And so what happened, in effect, was with the end of the Cold War, this inside system became the outside system. It became a global order. And it wasn't simply the US and its other countries pushing liberalism onto the rest of the world. It was a real interest in other countries joining the system. The problem is, in some ways, that it then created a larger, less governed system, and a variety of different weaknesses emerged. I would mention two. One is, in some sense, the mobilization of capitalism overran its political foundations. The G7 no longer became the ideal unit for governing the world system. And secondly, the social purposes of the international order shifted. It wasn't this sense of we are all in it together, there's an alternative project, the Soviet Union and its allies, the sense that we are not necessarily in a system to protect ourselves from something larger. That was gone. And so that had consequences as well. It became less of a club and more of a kind of global public utility. Finally, I'll just say that there are green shoots. There's seeds, I think, of a new internationalism. One is simply driven by you might say, the backlash to the backlash. That is to say, there is at least some sense that the return of walls, the return of a kind of nationalism of a less progressive sort is not necessarily generating the kind of outcomes that you want. And I think of Brexit as one example of this, that Brexit may not be what Britain voted for, and maybe that pathway away from the EU is not necessarily one that other countries will want to emulate. Secondly, there are other internationalist leaders. There are stakeholders in this system, Japan, Germany, and South Korea. I think this is something that we heard yesterday, that South Korea really has a stake in this order and has incentives to step forward as a new kind of leader. And then finally, there are new kinds of internationalisms, I think, out there. And if you look at the long durée, if you look at internationalism over 2 centuries, you will conclude that internationalism works best when it's connected to domestic projects of building a better society. And I think this was the time of FDR. This was the embedded liberalism of the 1950s and 60s. And so the reconnection of international to things that matter to us at home. And it seems to me that that's the ultimate test. Thank you.
Thank you. Yuli, Tamir?
Yeah. Well, first, thank you for your invitation to come here. It's my second time in Korea, and I've really learned a lot. You know, we Middle Eastern, we think our problems are the worst. And going away and looking at other parts of the world, it gives you, I think, a perspective, and I've learned a lot yesterday, and I appreciate very much the opportunity of being here. I would like to open by following up on some of the things that were already been said here. I think the most important one is that internationalism and nationalism, the relationship between the two, keep oscillating back and forth. I have a chapter in my new book that reviews these policies from 1918 to 2018, and it is inspired by James Bond. It is called Never Say Never, because things keep coming back. Nothing is actually going to disappear. Nothing is going to reappear totally. There's not going to be something utterly new. Things are just going to be rebalanced. And I think what we're seeing now is an act of rebalancing. And I'm not utterly sure it's the wrong kind of approach. So what we're seeing now, as we've heard earlier, is more and more internal policies affecting international policies. So the two are sort of being in some kind of an interaction that affects the way people draw conclusions, present policies, and also listen to the people when they draw these policies in order to recruit them to support a certain kind of policy. So that, I think, is a welcome change. Now, nationalism is emerging all over Europe. It has been there always in the Middle East. I think it's re-emerging in other parts of the world. And here again, I think we should be very careful to acknowledge that we can see the whole spectrum of nationalism. We're very sensitive, and rightly so, to the right wing, to the more xenophobic type of nationalism that is emerging. But the right-wing nationalism pushes the center also to a new kind of more liberal, progressive nationalism that has been neglected for several years, probably since Fukuyama's declaration that liberalism has won, and just forget about everything else because there is no alternative. Alternatives are coming back, and even moderate leaders, I think we've spoken last night over dinner about Macron, we're speaking about Angela Merkel or whoever will come after her, they will be more to the center, I mean, between nationalism and internationalism. They will have to reposition themselves in order to take into account some of the justified claims made by nationalist movements around the world. So, in my analysis, one of the reasons that we're seeing extreme national movements emerging around Europe but other places has much to do with the fact that the liberal progressive camp gave nationalism away and just left the door open to the more extreme forces to take over something that has been actually fundamental to the emergence of the modern democratic liberal state. Some sort of social solidarity, understanding of who we are, why we do things together, why we owe things to each other. This kind of a very basic type of question was answered by this combination of nationalism and liberal views, and it has been sort of almost forgotten when things got more stable and nationalism became almost obvious. People didn't see it. It was transparent. Now with the changes around the globe, nationalism is very visible again. And I think that the way to look forward and to have a more optimistic view, if you wish, is to try and understand what are the real problems nationalists around the world raise. I think many of them are economic concerns. I think the events around the Notre Dame are actually quite telling. The moment where the richest families of France are giving money to rebuild the Notre Dame, and that, rather than inspiring gratitude, inspires anger. It shows something about what the real concern of the people in the street are. And they are looking at the mega-rich families and saying, they have taken power out of our hands, which is not necessarily only a nationalistic statement, it is also a democratic kind of concern. So I would say two things to conclude. First of all, I think we are in a process of transition, and processes of transitions are always very confusing because you don't know which way it's going to go. And second, that in this process of transition, national issues will become more prominent, and international policies will be dictated by this balance between the internal and external point of view, with a desire to make things somehow more comprehensible to the people, explaining foreign policies in different terms, making them clear why they are beneficial to the people of each and every country, and even more than that, of sharing the costs and benefits of internationalism more fairly among the different social classes. So I think we have this very interesting combination of class issues, national issues, international issues, all sort of in the melting pot now. I'm not sure what is going to come up after this period, but I'm not wholly pessimistic. I think maybe we'll get a more socially attuned kind of globalism, and that wouldn't be too bad.
Thank you. Paul Wolfowitz?
First, am I on? Okay.
Yes.
First of all, as so many other speakers, my compliments to Asan and my appreciation for being here. And I'm thinking, when I heard the very accurate compliment paid to Ed Feulner for what he did with heritage, building it from almost nothing to a very, very influential institution, I'm reminded that in Chung Ju-young's autobiography, he makes it very clear, I don't want to be remembered as a businessman. I don't want to be remembered as a financier. I want to be remembered as a builder. And I think he'd be very proud of what what MJ and Chaibong have done in building Asan in somewhat the same way that Ed did with heritage, out of literally nothing but a vision of where to go, and building it stage by stage to where it's now, I suppose, one of the most prominent gatherings of policy thinkers in East Asia, and which is the region of the future. So my compliments to Asan for all of that. I want to try briefly to address this question of nationalism versus internationalism in two different senses of the word. One is with respect to process and international system, and the other with respect to the question that is the question of the conference, i.e. Korea's future. What is Korea's choice? Let me start by explaining, in case it doesn't translate well, what a false choice is. An illustration of a false choice is the caricature of the classic State Department options paper, where option one is you can do action A and it will unfortunately lead to nuclear war. Option two is you can do action B and unfortunately it will lead to surrender. Option three is the middle course, and that's what we recommend. You may have heard yesterday, but not have caught it. I didn't catch it, frankly. Two Texans, Jim Steinberg and Karen House, exchanging witticisms about the Texas joke. There is no middle course except a yellow line and a dead armadillo, meaning a dead animal that moves very slowly and gets killed by cars. So with all of that as background, I still want to say, I believe with respect to process, there is a very important middle ground between internationalism and nationalism. And that, I guess, I would label multinationalism. And I think I heard in some of the other speakers an allusion to what, to me, is the same thing. At the risk of being shocking, let me say that I don't believe that the peace and prosperity that the world had enjoyed in the many decades, and it wasn't entirely peaceful, of course, or entirely prosperous, but overall, by historical standards, pretty remarkable after World War II. it was not the result of the big international organizations, of the UN, of the World Bank, IMF, GATT, or WTO. In fact, at the risk of really getting in trouble, I think the contribution of the World Bank in some cases was good, in other cases was marginal, in many other cases was actually counterproductive. When the World Bank gave money to governments that were doing the right thing, like in Korea and in Taiwan and in China, it produced good results. But I think you have to say the results were not so much the product of the international institution as they were of the national institutions that made the right decisions and took their countries on the right course. With respect to the issue of peace, the UN in particular made some good contributions, but some very bad ones. I believe if it weren't for the UN Security Council, there might have been an intervention, for example, in Rwanda that would have saved almost 1 million lives that were lost in that genocide. It can lead to paralysis, and paralysis can lead to very bad results. I would submit that the threat to the liberal democratic order is not primarily from the internal troubles of the democracies, although they are very real, but I think they are recoverable. I think the bigger threat actually comes from the imperial restoration being attempted by a number of countries, particularly Russia and Iran, and most of all by China, who unfortunately might find some common interest in their desire to see democracy fail in other parts of the world. So I think the right answer to all of that is again, what was the internationalism of the post-World War II period that really made a difference were the alliances like NATO, like the U.S.-Japan alliance, the U.S.-Korea alliance, and a great many other informal international coalitions that were built without formal treaties but made a huge difference. For example, the relationships that the United States had with the Persian Gulf countries that made such a difference in reversing the invasion of Kuwait back in 1991. And I think that sort of coalition building remains critical in the situation today. And I think in that respect, there's reason for some optimism. I think that without going into a Cold War mentality of containing China, nevertheless, some of the biggest and most important countries in this part of the world have gotten together, meaning Japan and the United States and Australia and India, to cooperate in ways that they didn't think about cooperating before. And I think that provides an instrument for beginning to establish order in this part of the world if it becomes necessary. But it's a contingent thing. And a lot of the contingency depends on how China itself behaves. The other question is, what's the choice for Korea? Let me start by saying nationalism is responsible, I guess you could say, for some of the worst crimes of history, but also for some of the greatest achievements. And it's impossible to read Chung Ju-young's autobiography without recognizing how his great achievements were driven by nationalism of the best kind, to call it patriotism. He was almost at every step of the way doing risky, difficult things, working, it seemed like 20 hours a day, 7 days a week, taking great risks, financial risks, risks of failure, because he believed in the future of his company and what it could do for his country. And it is patriotism, as he makes very clear. I think that that issue comes up in the context of the nuclear negotiations. In a sense, at the risk of oversimplifying, I think that the international issue at stake in the nuclear negotiations, the issue is more international. One could say that South Korea is already under a threat from the North, from conventional weapons that is almost as serious as nuclear weapons. And the nuclear threat was there long before North Korea began to develop medium-range, much less intercontinental range missiles. And there is actually a real danger of coming to some kind of agreement with North Korea that preserves the nuclear threat to South Korea and the conventional threat, perhaps even the nuclear threat to Japan, but puts the United States first. I think that would be a terrible mistake. And I think South Korea is entirely justified in saying we have interests in this negotiation and those have to be respected. But I would say the interests are not just the interest in reducing the nuclear threat to South Korea. I think the interest that South Korea has in avoiding, and here I know this becomes controversial in this country, avoiding unification on North Korean terms, but approaching unification, which is something that is deeply desired, I believe, on both left and right in South Korea, and I would imagine uniformly in North Korea if they were ever allowed to express their views freely. Whether it's going to be unification on North Korean terms or unification, let me put a milder version of it, where North Korea really becomes like China became under Deng Xiaoping, a reformed communist country, hardly a liberal democracy, but nevertheless one that can deal with South Korea as an equal and respect it as an equal. It seems to me that requires, among other things, some focus on several issues that don't get addressed in this agenda, unfortunately, in my view. One of them is the issue of North Korean refugees in China, who unfortunately get labeled here, I guess, by the South Korean government as defectors. They're not defectors, they're refugees in every sense of the word and should be treated as such. And I believe both the United States and South Korea and other countries of the world should be much more open to doing for those refugees what was done in the 1980s for the Indo-Chinese refugees from Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos, which was one of the few great humanitarian achievements of the 20th century, which is not noted for its humanitarian achievements, but the rescue of some million Vietnamese and other refugees is really remarkable. I'm not saying the problems are exactly the same, but there's enough similarity that we ought to learn from that success. The second issue that ought to be on the agenda in some form, and is not, is the issue of North Korea's conventional buildup. If we're going to say they need nuclear weapons in order to deter an American attack on North Korea, which I think is a joke, the United States is not going to undertake a war against North Korea with all the costs that it would entail, both for the United States and importantly for South Korea. But then if we're going to talk about the prospects for some kind of economic reform in the North, the idea that they should be continuing to pour massive resources and manpower into this buildup along the demilitarized zone that no longer has any purpose except to threaten escalation in the event of an incident, I think that is an issue that ought to be on the agenda. And the third issue I would say that ought to be on the agenda is the issue of freedom of movement. Personally, I'm skeptical about all the things that I read about how Kim Jong-un really aspires to follow the course of China or the course of Vietnam. I think when Kim Jong-un goes to Vietnam, he doesn't see the virtues of a communist state that allows enough freedom that can actually succeed economically. He sees the virtue of a communist state that defeated the United States. I don't mean to be cynical about it, but I think that's what he sees. I think that the real key to reform in North Korea has to be a willingness to say that the founding fathers of that horrific dictatorship, i.e. the father and grandfather of Kim Jong-un, made terrible mistakes, and he's probably one of the last people in the world who can actually admit that. So I remain a skeptic. But I do think if we want to actually see some real progress, there's got to be real progress in the North with respect to freedom of movement, both inside the country and between the country and the outside world. When the United States began the opening to China and Deng Xiaoping became the supreme leader there, we still had enormous pressure on the Soviet Union to permit free emigration, particularly of Soviet Jews. So there was American legislation that put severe sanctions on countries that did not allow free emigration. Deng Xiaoping was asked, I believe, on his first visit to the United States in 1979, first and last, I guess, for the opening of official relations between our countries. Would he allow people to emigrate? He said, well, how many millions do you want? We'll give you as many as you want. And indeed, with all the pessimism that one can have about the latest turn in the course of China, and skepticism about what some of the Chinese students do in the United States, I think there are both enormous statistical and anecdotal evidence that this flow of Chinese outside of China has also had a huge liberalizing impact on Chinese elite attitudes, which hopefully is something that will come forward in the future and I hope produce some reversal in this terrible course that Emperor Xi Jinping has set China on today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before I turn questions to the floor, because I'm sure there are many of you who want to ask our panelists questions, I'll have very brief questions to all of you. And so if you could just answer it in a very short, succinct way. Let me just go down the line, beginning with Pascal Boniface. You mentioned that 10 out of 28 governments in Europe have a far-right party in the government. Is this a long-term trend?
I hope not, and I don't know, but I think it's a result of the economic crisis of 2008 and refugee crisis in 2015. In 2015, we have received 1 million of refugees. Last year,
France did.
No, in Europe.
In
EU.
Okay.
In EU. No, in France, it was. In Germany, it's almost 700,000, right. Because Germany needs workers, and so they accept more people than other countries. But last year, due to the agreement with Turkey, and also perhaps due to the change of regime in Ethiopia, we had received only 90,000 refugees. So I think that the political aspect is still there, but the symptom is over. And I hope that soon they will decrease. It depends also on the electoral system, because in France we have two terms to run the election, and it's much more difficult for the far right to gain power. When you have proportional election, it's easier for them.
Easier, right? Okay. To Ed Feulner, you stressed the dichotomy between old Europe and new Europe. But I think many people in this audience are concerned about the old U.S. and the new U.S. And so my question to you is, can you make America great again without allies?
Wow. No, but I think what you have to do is you have to strengthen the alliance in both directions. It isn't just the U.S. defending Europe, it's also Europe defending themselves and contributing to NATO. It's the same thing over here with Korea, with Japan. No, we cannot do it alone. I think we've pretty well passed that possibility in the world, but let's make it a two-way street, and I think that's what President Trump is trying very hard to assert.
Okay. John, you are a passionate believer in a liberal international order and the positive attributes of new internationalism. We all get that. But I think what President Trump has done, unwittingly or otherwise, is he has focused like a laser on what it costs to maintain global leadership. And so my question to you is, who pays or who assumes the burden of maintaining this liberal international order?
Yeah, I think it's a good question, and it has so many moving parts and bargains and dimensions that to talk about it as one order in some sense obscures and conflates and makes it difficult for you to really identify costs and benefits. But on the specific issue of what the U.S. pays and what it gets, I think there's been a pretty strong consensus over the decades that it's a huge bargain for the United States. It gives the United States access to allies that are themselves rising states, capitalist democracies that have their own wherewithal, that provide support and trade and mutual cooperation on issues of mutual vulnerability. The U.S. gets, in some sense, in the bargain, a kind of first citizen role in setting the agenda, in providing leadership, and those sorts of things. In return, it gets partners who have, in the bargain, access to the United States. The institutions that we talk about, alliance institutions, multilateral institutions, are not simply mechanisms for cooperation. They're also for mutual consultation and exchange, a kind of decentralized system of representation. So voice opportunities, getting to have ready access to the United States having access to its allies, this kind of larger kind of decentralized system has benefits going both directions. So I think the key insight is that it's not something that you can instrumentalize, and this is what I would say is a real problem with President Trump, is that you define the alliance relationship in terms of a number when there is a great deal of other aspects to that relationship that are creating value that aren't reflected in that number. So it's not an easy task to talk about cost and benefits, but I think it's a pretty overwhelming case that the U.S. is getting more than what it pays for.
Ed Feulner, I detected a little shift in your body posture. So do you want to rebut what he said quickly?
Yeah, no, I'll pass right now.
I see, okay.
Yeah.
Turning to Yuli Tamir, you made a very strong case that there is an ebb and flow between nationalism and internationalism. My question to you is, in a period of growing economic discontent in almost all of the major economies, can democracies ensure a careful balance between nationalism and internationalism?
That's a very difficult question. I'm not sure, but I think the mere fact that you phrase the question this way is already a change of perception of how we should approach nationalism and internationalism. So we are now looking at a more, I think, interactive approach towards both issues, thinking what are, we usually used to think that our national policies will influence the way we are perceived internationally. So that was a common thought. But I think now leaders around the world think what we do internationally affect the way we are perceived internally. And it could change the language, the perceptions, but also the policies. And I think the most important part of it is, again, who gains from internationalism and who loses. I think the main discontent of many of the European countries, I don't know enough about this part of the world, is that people say, okay, internationalism has worked well, globalism, neoliberalism has worked well, but not for us. So how are we becoming part of the gaining, the gaining parties? So, and that's, I think it is important to say, it's not an illegitimate claim. I mean, too many people have dismissed it as like, okay, all these nationalists are, rioters in the street of Paris. The riots are actually dangerous and not in place. But behind them, and behind the people who voted for Trump, and behind the people around the world who support nationalism, there is a real discontent that it was too easy to ignore. And I think now, the biggest achievement of all these movements are not the people they elect, but the discomfort that we feel sitting here and the obligation we feel now to rethink our policies in order to recapture power. And that might be sort of the positive wake-up call that we have received, and maybe if we act rightly, we can gain power again.
To Paul Wolfowitz, you mentioned that national institutions played a critical role in the post-45 era, and I would agree with you. But looking forward in the next 20, 30 years, absent a strong U.S. leadership in the world, who else do you expect to fill the void? As an American policymaker in the past, will you be satisfied with China taking that role?
I think it's pretty obvious no, but I think I'm going to pick up on John Ikenberry's comments. It is very hard to say who gains and who loses. And it's very easy in a political rally to say the United States is being played for a sucker by our rich European allies. It's a talking point, it gets cheers, but I think it's, to put it mildly, unhelpful and misleading. However, I think at the heart of a lot of what Trump has been talking about and his trade people have been talking about is that China has been gaining phenomenally, partly at the expense of the United States, and partly it really doesn't matter whether it was at the expense of the United States, but it's dangerous to us. And the things that you can read just in the last few months about how the United States is losing the critical arms race to China in the area of artificial intelligence, I think gets to the heart of what is really important. We won may be a debatable verb, but at any rate, we came out on top in the Cold War in spite of Sputnik and the so-called lead that the Soviets had in missile technology, which didn't last very long and was somewhat hyped even by President Kennedy, I think. This one is not hyped by anybody. It's very real. It is based in no small measure on stealing American technology ruthlessly, and then ruthlessly pushing ahead with surveillance techniques that could not be developed in any democratic country. They're really shocking. And I do think that's an arms race, and it's one that we critically have to win if we're going to maintain any kind of democratic leadership in the face of what is, I believe, a real totalitarian challenge. I don't know how you do that. I do think I'm a bit inclined in the direction of saying that something like the Cold War investment in science and technology by the government and by the Defense Department is part of the answer, but it's only part of the answer. The last thing I would say is that I do think withdrawing from the TPP was a terrible mistake, but it was a bipartisan mistake. And not only was Hillary Clinton clear that she would withdraw from it, but President Obama, who for some reasons never embraced a trade agreement, embraced this one. But when it came to a matter of getting his majority leader to bring it to the vote in the Senate, he did nothing. So it's unfortunate, but I think it was an opportunity missed, and it may be an opportunity that is still there because the what do they call the TPP 11 are proceeding with some version of the system. And I think it would be good not to be dogmatic about bilateralism is the only way to do trade agreements. I think there's an opportunity in that one.
Okay, thank you. In the remaining 18 minutes, I would like to open it up to the floor. Please direct your questions to the panelists. And so any persons have questions? I'm sure there are. Yes, TJ.
TJ Pempel from UC Berkeley. I guess the question goes primarily to the issue of how the economics of internationalism plays off against the economics of domestic or nationalist politics. I think this was hinted at by Tamir's point, but it seems to me that one of the underlying problems behind the rise in nationalism is the ways in which the global economic system, financial system, have been utilized domestically in many places for very disproportionate shares of the benefits of internationalism. And I guess the underlying question is whether there's an international system that can somehow dovetail effectively with nationalism in a way that does not necessarily leave incredible carnage among huge numbers of people domestically.
TJ, can you give the microphone to Colonel Zhao?
Oh, sorry.
Senior Colonel Zhao from China. There is an argument that says the United States is the biggest builder of the international system or international rules. But on the other hand, it is the biggest destroyer of the international system or international rules. Or make it more, clearly, it was the biggest builder of the international system before the Trump administration. But now it is the biggest destroyer. So I'd like to have your comment. Thank you.
All right. Yes, ma'am. Can we have a microphone? Thank you.
Thank you. My name is Mari McCauley from the International Organization for Migration in Geneva. And my question is to all of the panelists to really ask about reflections on what I would call, and others have called, transnational tribalism. So building on multilateralism, nationalism, and internationalism, we're now in an era of tribalism that is working transnationally. I work obviously in the area of migration, and a lot of new research looking at social media impacts is indicating that some of the rhetoric around anti-immigration sentiment is working across national lines and across international lines, where we're having political parties being influenced by activist groups, predominantly the far right, but that is changing governance arrangements and changing political decisions more pointedly. And we saw that with the Global Compact on Migration and a number of European, especially countries, withdrawing very close to the final conference in Marrakesh. So I think there's another element that needs to be added to the discussion, which is transnational tribalism and how technology is advancing that, and what can be done by states and what can be done by the international community to try and counter some of these disruption influences that we're seeing.
Okay, I'll take one more in this round. Gil?
My question is for Paul Wolfowitz. And you brought this theme to Korea's choice, and you recommended 3 things Korea should do, which I took to mean more internationalist responses towards North Korea, whether it's dealing with refugee issues or freedom of movement or conventional arms. And so my query is, how does that fit into Korea's specific situation where it faces opposition from China and Russia to all those policies? Does it take a sort of a grand internationalist approach to doing things according to the idealistic principles of managing this environment, or does it try to pragmatically deal with the opposition it faces from surrounding countries and manage this situation in a way that may not look very good in terms of general principles?
Okay. I'll take one more question from Dr. Han Sung-ju, and then I'll go back to the panelists. Dr. Han?
Yes, by putting this as nationalism versus internationalism as if they are antithetical to each other, isn't it possible, in fact, wasn't it a fact that the United States sought internationalism in the interest of national interest? And if you take the alliance, for example, why did the United States have troops in Japan and South Korea? Why did the United States sign alliances with Japan and South Korea? The United States wanted to deal with the Soviet Union. Now there's China. Now the United States wanted to have a forward base in the Asian continent. The United States has to deal with North Korean nuclear weapons, ICBMs, and all that has something to do with America's own national interest. And John Ikenberry put it as access, but it's more than access, very, very concrete U.S. national interest. And therefore, why, well, if the United States now says the U.S. is doing a favor, defending Japan, defending South Korea, and therefore South Korea and Japan have to their own part. Yes, but why is this not obvious before and now not so obvious at this time, after, especially after Mr. Trump came to power?
Thank you very much. Can I ask Paul Wolfowitz to answer all the panelists, the ladies' questions on growing tribalism and how that is impacting growing nationalism in almost all our countries? And then you can then answer other questions that you may want to.
Why don't I start with the ones that were directed at me specifically? I don't have a magic answer. It's a great question that Gilbert Rosman asked. It seems to me it's something that needs to be thought about in approaching what may be an impending stalemate in these nuclear negotiations. And the issue, in a way, is whether it's possible to insert more specific South Korean interests into those negotiations, which I may have overcharacterized, but I don't think I went too far, actually, in saying that it's much more so far about the interests of Japan and the United States, and there are other interests that ought to be considered. We became awfully focused on the nuclear subject for very good reason, I understand that, but it's like the way magicians will try to distract the audience by holding a bright, shiny object while you don't notice what the other hand is doing. I think we may have gotten a little bit led down that road. And very briefly to Han Sung-ju's question, my guess at it is the following. I think the reason that those alliances were formed in the immediate aftermath of World War II was let me just say, I would disagree with the notion that it was the United States acting in its own interest in a narrow sense, but its own interest in a very big sense, which is we'd been through the experience of ending up in big wars because we allowed small wars to start, and it was a belief that deterring those other smaller wars in an earlier stage with these alliances was the key to avoiding a repetition of the disaster that was the 1930s, 1940s. And I think if you want to know why that's less perceived today, I would just say it's unfortunately historical forgetfulness. The United States particularly is a country that tends, with the exception of our own Civil War, to forget history rather quickly. And that worked to great advantage for Germany and Japan, but I'm not so sure it works to the advantage of defending a posture that's based on an understanding of what happens when you allow those sorts of defensive alliances to wither. With respect to the question about tribalism, I claim no expertise whatsoever, but I would suggest that perhaps you suggested that maybe it's the influence of poison spread over the internet. I'm sure that's part of it. And I only started looking at Twitter about 12 months ago, so I'm a naive in this respect, but it is amazing how much trash gets spread around so easily and believed in. But I also think there's something fundamental, and that is that I don't believe the United States has faced mass immigration across its own borders of the so-called illegal kind in its history. And I'm pretty certain that Europe hasn't experienced that either. So you have, in the past, the United States has eventually adapted very well to these waves of immigration, which initially produced enormous anti-Irish feeling, then anti-Italian feeling, then anti-Jewish feeling. I mean, for all of the fact that we are a nation of immigrants, and I'm very proud of it, and it's been crucial to my own family, it's been crucial to the success of the United States. We've been able to absorb it gradually in the past, and now it's been coming, I think, in a scale that makes it much harder to adjust to. I think it's even more difficult in Germany and in Europe, but I would submit that's got as much to do with the problem as anything that's communicated by the internet.
Thank you. But given the interest of time, can you, from Yuli on down, if you could just make it as succinct as possible, your answers. Yeah, please.
Yeah, just very briefly. First of all, I think the costs of internationalism should be rethought and redistributed, which is, again, it's mostly internal policies, but it has to do with taxation, it has to do with bringing jobs back, it has to do with giving some preferences to companies that produce in your own countries, it has to do with taxing mega sort of corporations, in order for people to feel. And one should say, people are not wrong when they say that they have been left out. This is, I think, the most important thing to acknowledge. Some people say, oh, they claim that, or they feel that. They have been left out, and they have been suffering economical austerity while others were prosperous in the same country. So that has to be amended, and I think if international policies would be seen in that perspective, I don't think people object to internationalism. They just want to have a fair share, and if you can convince them that they have the fair share, I think their attitudes will change. And I think this is also true about immigration. I think immigration is a secondary issue. If there was a time of prosperity and people would feel, we're all gaining from this, wonderful power and human capital that is coming in, then things would have been different. But when you see the spread of immigration, where do immigrants concentrate? I mean, saying Europe admitted that number of immigrants, that's right. But then go to the neighborhoods, see where they're concentrated, see who pays the price, see how much weaker the states were when they even didn't pay any attention to the need to not assimilate, but adjust immigrants to the new countries and the new economies. And you will understand that the problem is not immigrants as such. It's again the question of distribution and again the question of responsibilities of the state, that if you open your doors, and I think you should open your doors, and many of the European countries must open their doors because they need young, manpower or women power coming in, but you have to manage it. And the fact that the state withdrew from managing social affairs had created this kind of problem that I think is now seen as far more severe than it really is. So again, it's internal politics that will, at the end of the day, if rightly mended, would reshape the way we see immigration and reshape international policies.
Thank you, John.
Yeah, on Han Ju's question, I too think it's the United States does not always appreciate how its own leadership of an order has created a kind of platform that other countries rely on for their own well-being from the beginning, from the 1940 period onward. And I think of South Korea, I mentioned that earlier, how important the presence of this multilateral system, both on the security side, the political side, the economic side, has been for Korea to make its democratic and economic transitions and become the great nation state that it is, and to experiment with its own nationalism. So Korea is in some sense the poster child of how an enlightened, self-interested American foreign policy working with its allies create something we can call a political order that benefits it while it creates opportunities for others. And Japan is a case as well, and Germany. I think of all the countries that are feeling the pain of America's kind of wrestling with whether it wants to continue to play this global role, it is Germany. And Merkel, who with the end of the Cold War, the unification of Germany could finally be on the right side of history. And the Chancellor could say there are two nevers that Germany believes in: never again and never alone. And that entails and requires a Europe for Germany to be attached to, and for a larger Atlantic and global system as well. So I think Keynes, after the Versailles settlement in 1919, said something very interesting, that the United States will soon find itself in a position where it has more influence over outcomes that other countries have more of a stake in. So in some sense, that's the case of the international system. The U.S. is less integrated into a global system than Europe is, than Korea is, than Japan is. So in some sense, it's more sheltered and independent. It's easier for it to say, let's go back to the books and see how much this is costing us. Whereas other countries, it's an existential consideration. So there's an imbalance in what's felt and what's registered. And just one final thing, if I could, on the economic side. I think one of the things that got wrong, and there will be books written on how, when the Cold War ended, we didn't quite shepherd the expansion, some people would say globalization, of economic and political liberalism worldwide. What was lost, as I said earlier, was this sense of a shared social purpose, and the sense that to be inside of this order is to have things that it makes you safer, makes you better off, creates shared capacity to solve problems, blah, blah, blah. That gets lost when there's no boundaries. Everybody's in, but nobody's in. It's more of a public utility you can plug into than a club you're a member of. And that is what happened, I think, partly. On specifically economic side of that, it's not, I think we kind of overdid the core value of this system is ever-growing interdependence. And that clearly is not what the founders in the 40s thought, that you want to have an open system, but you want to have a managed open system. You didn't have capital market openness, for example. And we have good work by economists today who tell us that after a certain point, growing interdependence between economies creates less efficiency gains and more distributional effects. That's Danny Roderick at the Kennedy School, which means you aren't getting outcomes that you can then redistribute to those who are losers in the globalization, because winners win more than losers lose. You get more distributional effects, and that creates inequality, and that creates the detachment, if you will, of classes and working groups, working people from the order. Okay. Thank you. Okay, sorry for taking.
Two quick points. First, on the tribalism question, I have no reservation about using the word assimilation. I mean, that's what really brought America together, and
I think
that's why
I wanted to say accommodation.
Okay, that's why I'm concerned when I see the public schools in Los Angeles, generation after generation, teaching immigrant children in 45 or 50 different languages. There is a point where you have to move it together. But the main point I'd like to make that hasn't really been covered adequately is to our Chinese friend who alleges that the United States is the big disruptor right now of the international order. And I say this as an individual who went together with all my colleagues in Washington, from Brookings, from Carnegie, from Peterson, and said, yes, China should become part of the world order. It should join WTO. It should be there. And we all said that very enthusiastically on the assumption that China, in fact, was going to live by the international standards and the international rules. But as Paul briefly hinted, and as we could doubtless devote a whole section to, China hasn't done that, and therefore the great disruptor right now in the White House is saying, hey, we are going to demand that there be a rebalancing, and we don't know quite how the trade agreement finally is going to come out between the U.S. and China, but I think it is, in fact, an indication that this is something that's a very real concern to Americans across the board, and probably to our allies around the world too, even if some of them are unwilling to admit it.
Thank you. Pascal?
Very quickly, because the time is running short, I think we must accept the nationalism of others. And nationalism could be the best and the worst thing, as Paul has stated, but if we could not accept our nationalism and deny the other nationalism. In this way, we could reconcile internationalism and nationalism. Nationalism is the love of yours, not the hate of the others. And coming to the other question, I fully agree with Yuli. We must not forget the social issue. And of course, it is a very important point.
Thank you very much. As we conclude this panel, I'm struck by the fact that Korea's choice on nationalism, internationalism, is also America's choice, and China's choice, and Japan's choice, and Israel's choice, and France's choice. Please join me in giving our great panel a wonderful applause for this panel. Thank you very much.